Hello and welcome to the 2020 National Diversity Council webinar series. My name is Dejaron Campbell and I manage the operations for our national learning and development programs. We're extremely excited to have you join us. Our topic for today is 5 strategies to achieve gender balance and the benefits thereof. Our featured presenter is Dave Rawell. Dave is currently a consultant at Parity Consulting. Dave, I will now turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Dejaron, and I'm very excited to be here also. This topic is very dear to my heart. I've been working on in this area for several years, and I think it's a topic I feel is really beneficial when I present it to other people for themselves and for their organizations. So again, happy to be here. A little bit about myself before we get going. Again, name is David Rawell. I'm with Parity Consulting. I started this consulting firm a couple of years ago after retiring from the federal government, where I was an instructor in leadership and diversity, diversity program manager. And at the end of that career, my work focused on gender specifically. I did a lot of work within the federal government and with some UN organizations in this regard. And from that, I ended up writing the book, Value and Voice, Solutions to Organizational Gender Balance, which really represents everything I'm going to talk about here today. Obviously, I won't be able to go into the depth that the book goes in. So if you want to follow up this webinar by purchasing the book, that'd be great. But the thrust of the book will all be contained within this presentation today. So without further ado, let's get started. For today, what I want to do first and foremost is define the term gender balance. This terminology is used within this field of study by a number of different colleagues of mine, and I noticed that some colleagues use it a little bit differently than maybe I would use it. And so first and foremost, I want to clarify the way I define gender balance, and I will do that throughout the presentation as well. I think it's very critical to understanding how you can make improvements in gender balance in your workplace, which will benefit your organization. And we will understand the importance of gender balance to your organization. We'll talk about what those benefits are, and then we'll identify means to achieve those benefits, both to the benefit of the organization as well as the benefit of the individuals within the organization as also. Throughout the presentation, you'll see these pop-up boxes in this orange color. Typically, when I do a workshop on increasing gender balance within the workplace or within an organization, it's a very participatory in nature. I didn't want to take out all that participation here. And so what I'll do is when I have a spot in my presentation where I would normally pause and talk to the audience, I'll just pause for a few seconds and let you consider the information that's been presented or consider a question that's been posted and let you think about that a moment or two before I go on with the presentation. So those will just be cues to both myself and to you to stop and consider what's being said for a moment and maybe come up with an answer to a question that's being posed. So you'll see those pop up throughout the presentation today. Start with Why, a great book. I know that many of you have probably read this book, but it's always the best place to start is why. All these organizations that do the research in the area of gender equality or any of these diversity metrics, Harvard Business Review, Catalyst, McKinsey, Pew Research Center, they all agree. They all agree that there are inherent benefits to an organization if an organization pursues better gender balance. Those are very significant in terms of not only monetary results, but also performance results and also experiential results as well. Speaking to the former, it has been found that there is a significant higher rate of return for those organizations that are better gender balanced. Up to 21% higher profits some of these organizations realize by addressing gender balance within their organization. Beyond just the profit metric, considering service organizations or whatever it is, whether you're producing a product, offering a service, understand that the performance in doing so is going to be a lot higher because gender balance yields a number of things that contributes to that performance. higher collective intelligence, for example, improved decision-making, improved communications, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, a company is 15% more likely at a minimum to better outperform those organizations that aren't trying to improve their balance within the organization. And of course, there's negative consequences to that as well. Without gender balance, you would have an imbalance of power and authority. I think that one is something that a lot of people are focused on, considering the representation in boardrooms, which we'll address, and those type of things. But understand that you're also in an imbalanced organization going to experience a biased focus in terms of your resourcing, for example. Where you're putting your money in research might be a place that bias is evidenced. You're going to have imbalanced representation to your stakeholders. Understand that the population of the United States is about 50% male and 50% female. If you got an imbalanced organization, you're not properly representing half of your stakeholders or half of your constituents or half of your customers correctly. Another thing that suffers in an imbalanced organization is the image itself of the organization. It's easy enough to find the balance, especially of groups that are public groups, even nonprofits. The record keeping allows you to go in and see the balance of the organization. That can show up in terms of your image. So that is out there and can be very negative when it's imbalanced. And again, we already talked about the performance metrics and those outcomes that suffer when an organization is imbalanced. And then let's not overlook personal harms that occur to the people within your organization when the organization is imbalanced, and we'll talk about that as well as we go along. We know it can be a problem. A number of you probably have turned in to this webinar today because it is a problem. That problem can be a very costly problem in terms of lawsuits that can arise because of imbalance in your organization. We also know that the lawsuits are principally based on discrimination towards females in your organization. I mean, it can be based on other things as well, sexual orientation, race, disabilities, those type of things also. But in terms of just gender alone, women are nearly twice as likely as men to have experienced discrimination in the workplace. And that, again, is a minimum. 30%, in fact, 30% of the women in your organization have experienced discrimination in one form or another. Something that we want to address, something that should not be ignored, of course. I want to point out before we go forward that a lot of the discrimination is specific to gender and specific to females in particular. A lot of the forms of discrimination are forms that only females will be subject to. For example, the maternal wall, whereas women are looked at more as motherly, for example, caretakers, these type of things more so than high performers or high producers or strong decision makers or whatnot. And sometimes that maternal wall gets in the way of really recognizing the abilities of women in the workplace. Tightrope, having to balance a native trait set that may differ from the male masculine dominated work set that prevails in the workplace, and trying to strike that balance between authenticity of who you are and balancing that authenticity with expectations, principally male imposed expectations in the workplace. Again, this is something that women have to contend with and other groups may not. Prove it again. I'll mention this statistic a few times, that women have to do 2.5 times the work to get the same amount of credit. Let me say that again. Women have to do 2.5 times the work to get the same credit as men. And again, that is a female-only discriminatory practice. And then there's a tug of war, and this is where women feel compelled to actually compete with each other for a perceived limited pie, if you will. And that causes some angst within the workplace. All these things are much worse in an imbalanced workplace, and that's why I mentioned them here. So are these biases, the discriminatory practices, whether they're the female-specific discriminatory practices or not, are they exclusive to males? Is this a male bias in the workplace? I want you to think about that a second and what you believe in that regard. And now I'm going to challenge that belief by throwing out just a couple of slides that show that it's not always a male bias, and in fact, it's pretty equal bias between male and female, where men rate female supervisors and subordinates lower than male supervisors and subordinates. But you know what? Women often and very, very often do the same. So this bias is both male and female. A lot of times I have to point this out early in the workshops I conduct because a lot of the men feel that I'm going after them. That's not true. Just because we want female equality or female gender balance in the workplace does not mean that's going to come at the cost of men or we're trying to attack men. Simply not true at all. These discriminatory practices and imbalance occur at the hands of women in the workplace as well. And this is what we want to overcome. It's not a blame game. It's about finding ways to better this, to better the performance of the organization, and to better the experience of those persons within it. Another thing I want to point out, and this is going to start getting into the realm of how I define balance, maybe differently than some other colleagues might, or maybe differently than what you have thought of it before. Surely, imbalance can be seen in terms of numbers, and this is often the case where we point out the number of representation in the boardroom, for example, or even greater representation in terms of number of male employees versus number of female employees. That as a metric can be indicative of a culture, but what we really want to focus on is the culture itself. And when that culture is imbalanced, when it's male dominated, a lot of other things happen in the workplace that cause this performance problem to begin with. Minority discomfort, and that can be, again, we're not just talking female necessarily here, this can apply to racial inequity as well, but it does certainly apply to gender inequity also. That because a person is a minority, if you're in a very strongly male-dominated workplace, women are going to feel that discomfort, and that's going to impede their performance. Cultural conformity. Conformity is going to impede performance, and there is more conformity, the more imbalanced a workplace is. Again, let me say that. The more imbalanced a workplace is, the more people, specifically women, have to feel that they have to conform, and that's going to be another performance inhibiting factor that's going to take place in an imbalanced organization. Tokenism, stereotype conformance, stereotype threat, illegitimacy, exclusionary practices, where the minority is excluded from practices, and I'll mention a couple of those as we go along. In an imbalanced organization, the minority is more strongly targeted with micro inequities. These micro inequities result over time, again, in performance issues. Disempowerment, loss of voice. I'm going to talk about loss of voice in particular, but just as an example, in an imbalanced organization, studies have found that women are talked over much, much strongly and forcibly than they are in more balanced organizations. And of course, discrimination that maybe not is overtly accepted or sanctioned or allowed, but it's just kind of the culture that allows it to happen because that culture is imbalanced to begin with. So all these things, while it can be tied to the numbers in an organization, what really is the factor here is the imbalance causes these things to occur that inhibit performance within the workplace. So what we want to do is balance this out. And so how do we balance? I like to ask my audience members to envision an old-fashioned scale where we have blue marbles on one side and pink marbles on another. And in most organizations, again, I'll use the word most, not all, but still today in many organizations, it's male-dominated. Now that may be in terms of real numbers, or it may be just in terms of culture, but there's still that dominance in place. For now, let's look at in terms of numbers. Even in a numbered scale, we need to figure out how to balance that scale out. So consider what are the ways that you can balance the scale. Of course, the first answer that comes to mind is probably that to equalize the numbers by adding more pink marbles to the other side of the scale so that equals out. But I'm going to say that there are actually three ways to balance the scale. One is that first one, to adjust the quantity, add more marbles in this case. But we can do another thing, we can adjust the mass. We can increase the weight, if you will, of the lone pink marble or the minority marble. And the third way I'm going to talk about, and this was where the 5 methods of balance come in, are we can manipulate the scale, but we'll get there in time. Most organizations and most of the messaging around balancing an organization is focused in this area. It's all about adding weight, equal numbers. In fact, it's gotten so much attention that a lot of laws have been put in place to address this. And if not for laws, maybe it's just policies within an organization or guidelines or targets or these type of things. There's a great deal of focus on balancing the numbers of the organization. And I'll mention this, not just organizations, a lot of institutions are looking at the benefits of balance as well, or the disadvantages of imbalance, and trying to address it through a numbered solution like this. There are a number of countries that have instituted quotas on the number of males and females that can be put on a ballot for an election, for example. India, believe it or not, is one of those where they're now saying that X number of women have to be on any provincial ballots. There are a number of companies, especially in Europe, where they have put in quotas where a number of board members have to be females. And so there's a lot of solutions being put into place to balance it based on the numbers. My work, however, I'll just tell you up front, my work, however, is not on balancing the numbers, and there's a reason for that. When I was working for the government, I was in a scientific organization, and we tried to balance this in this way for many years. And we found it very, very difficult. And I finally reached a point where, as much as I beat my head against the wall trying to figure out new ways to balance these numbers, I realized that's not the only goal involved. There are other ways to achieve balance that I'll get to in this presentation. And so the number solutions are not always the only solutions. That doesn't make them bad solutions. I'm just going to argue that maybe our focus is in the wrong place. And when we change the focus, we open up other possibilities that I'm going to entertain in this webinar as we go through. So, but we can simply balance the scale by adding the weight, adding the numbers, or addressing the numbers. And there are great results by doing so. Not only in terms of weight given to a person's voice, for example, but also in terms of these other things we mentioned, credibility, for example, increases when we're more balanced in terms of numbers and these type of things. Visibility increases. So there are a number of advantages to taking a numbered or a add weight type solution. I'm not going to dismiss them, but that's one way we can address it. Understand, and this is one of the experiences I ran into, there can be hurdles in trying to generate balance in this way. Hiring discrimination, and there's all kinds of ways to overcome hiring discrimination we'll talk about, but understand that it's a very real problem. And again, hiring discrimination is very much related to promotional discrimination and other forms of discrimination in the workplace as well. Obviously, much of that is biased discrimination, just showing itself in this form. And the research shows that this is still continuing today very, very frequently and very, very prominently. And furthermore, this type of discrimination is being perpetrated by both men and women in near equal numbers. And so this is one hurdle that you have to overcome if you're looking for a numbered solution, is getting over this biases that impacts this. This is where my organization that I worked with for many years really ran into a hurdle. And a number of organizations that I've talked about as a private consultant have had the same thing I'll mention, that this has just been a very difficult thing. We'll talk about solutions here on the next slide. There are ways to get over this hurdle or go around this hurdle or knock the hurdle down, whichever analogy you care to use. A lot of people I've been talking to lately are turning to software solutions to do this, and there are a number of them out there. It's not the focus of my presentation today, but a lot of people have tried these things like blind auditions, for example, if your organization is bringing people in by audition, blind hiring practices, going through, for example, one way a lot of organizations are addressing it is to look at the wording within job announcements and make sure that they are gender neutral within those job announcements. That can help. All these type of things indicated on this slide can be very helpful towards achieving this balance. One thing that also always comes into question is quotas. I'm going to let you think a moment about what you feel about quotas, and I'll give you my thoughts on quotas as well. But think whether you have a favorable opinion of quotas or unfavorable opinion of quotas. I will say that at times it can seem that quotas are very necessary. I think the word quotas itself can be very inflaming to some people. Maybe you want to use the word targets. I think targets not only shifts the inflammatory interpretation of the word, but it also shifts the focus a little bit. I think one of the biggest problems with quotas is that it does have that reputation that we are trying to meet a certain number at all costs. And sometimes people think that that at all costs comes at the cost of other people, whereby maybe targets doesn't have that same connotation. But the other thing about quotas, besides the inflammatory nature of the word itself, is the fact that what that does is it sets up typically a minimum. To me, that's a low bar. Why would we put a minimum in place when the goal, when that should not be the ultimate goal? The goal should be, as I'm going to talk about later, a matter of fully valuing everyone in the organization and bringing them into the organization in an equitable and equitable institution. So personally, I kind of see quotas as a necessary evil in some points. It can be inflaming, but at the same time, it's very, very necessary. And I will say that that is true in some cases. But let's move beyond the quotas and look at what we're really trying to do by alternating those numbers. And that's where I'm going to go with this. So I'm going to now redefine what I mean by gender balance. Yes, gender balance can mean to some people that the number of males in the organization is close to an equal number of females within the organization, or the number of women on a board of a corporation is equal or near equal to the number of men on a board. A lot of people will see balance in those terms, those numbered terms. I don't, by the way, if you want to buy that definition, that's fine. It can be a definition. I don't think it's the most important definition. I have other colleagues I talk to, not only in the US, but in the UK, some of them I'm very familiar with. They like to use the word gender balance to talk about the balance of work, that women are having the same responsibilities as men in the workplace, and look at balance in that way. I like that definition also. Again, that's not my focus, not the way I define gender balance, but that's another way to do so. And sometimes that even carries through not only responsibilities in the workplace, but talking about responsibilities at home too. So there are some consultants out there that merge both work life and home life together and try to strike that balance, saying, what the shared responsibilities are in the workplace, we also need shared responsibilities back at home. I'm not going to quarrel with that definition of gender balance. It also is a good definition of gender balance. It just is not my definition of gender balance. I like to focus on things like participation. Who's given the opportunity to participate in an organization or an institution or a company, whatever the group is? And is that participation near equitable? And let me say this, just because an organization is 75% men and 25% women does not mean that participation should be 75% men and 25% women. Let me give you an example. Let's say you are sending people to a conference from your organization or from your group. If your group is 75% male, that doesn't mean that you send 75% male to the conference and 25% female to the conference. You can manipulate that. When you get to the conference, who's getting the podium time? If, again, your organization is represented by 75% male and 25% female, does that mean that the podium time should be so set that way as well? That 75% of your allocated speaking time is done by males and 25% by females? No, of course not. My definition of balance says that regardless of what the company ratios are between men and women, the participation should be more equalized. Does that mean time should be split 50% male and 50% female? Not necessarily, but that can be a target or a goal. And to me, that's my definition of balance or parity or equity, whatever you want to call it. It's all about participation within the organization and trying to equalize that. Just yesterday, I read an article, I can't remember where it was posted, but they quoted the diversity and inclusion director from Walmart, and I love this quote. It's at the bottom of this slide. But he says that gender equity is a culture thing, and that's exactly what it is. It's much more a culture thing than it is a number thing. So what does the culture do? For example, in a male-dominated culture, or maybe it's reversed the other way around, when one gender is dominating the other, there's imbalances that occur. In a male-dominated culture, women are 20% less likely than men to get the needed feedback from their supervisor. That's what we're talking about. That's a cultural issue. That's not a number issue, and that's also a performance issue. Here's another example. Women are consulted on important decisions 3 times less than men. For my money, in a balanced organization, regardless of how many women are in the organization and how many men are in the organization, women should be getting an equal amount of feedback that the men are getting. And regardless of how many women are in an organization and how many men are in an organization, women should get the same decisional opportunities that men get. That's the way I define balance. This is a exercise I use in my workshop to try to demonstrate the impacts of this. So the exercise goes like this. I have participants find the numbers from 1 to 54 in sequence, starting with 1, and then you find the 2, and then you find the 3. And I'll let you do that very shortly. We have limited time here today, but just try to find, maybe the first 10 numbers on that chart here, and I'll pause for a second. You can do so. Okay, now let me try to help you out a little bit. What if I, as your supervisor, I asked you to perform this task, I either gave it to you this way, or perhaps I gave it to you this way and told you that the numbers are always going to be in each of the squares in order. So the number 1 is going to be in the first square, then you go over to the next square, you'll find the number 2, and the next square you'll find the number 3, then you go down, you'll find the number 4, and then like that. That tool becomes very handy, lets you perform at a much quicker pace. The problem is when we look at things about feedback, women being given less feedback than men, basically what's happening is they're not getting this tools. They're left trying to perform this function where typically men in the organization are given more tools and thus perform better. That is a direct effect of an imbalanced organization, and that's what's going to happen. And that's why your women aren't going to be able to perform at the level they're going to be able to perform in a more balanced organization. So rather than adding women, this is my position. It's about reshaping the process to increase the involvement of the women that are already in your workplace. Provide them not only a seat at the table, provide them not only a voice, but also make sure that that voice is valued so that the end result is what I call contribution and influence parity. And I'm going to tell you how to get there. So that is the goal, contribution and influence parity within an organization. Therein is my definition of gender balance. So one way we can get that parity is to increase the mass of the women that are already there, increase their value, empowerment. A lot of organizations are doing this. In addition to trying to balance out the numbers, they're also doing empowerment activities to increase the value of the women in the organizations. I've participated in a lot of this myself. I've conducted a number of women's leadership workshops, not only nationally, but also internationally, with this goal in mind. This, again, is a good way to address imbalance. Is it the best way? Again, I'll just say it is a good way to address imbalance. The one problem I would say about inherent is the outlook that the solution here is to fix the women. We kind of relieve men of the responsibility and we kind of put the onus all on the women to increase their value. Sure, we'll help them in that. We'll give them leadership workshops, for example. We'll give them other empowerment tools, but we've kind of relieved men of responsibility to help out in this regard. And we're just focusing on fixing the women. That's going to help balance, don't get me wrong, but I'm not sure that should be our only focus. Best practices in empowerment. Most organizations are putting in mentorships. A couple of caveats in terms of mentoring programs. Understand that many mentoring programs assign women to other women, likely women in more powerful positions within the organization. Understand, however, that sometimes the people in power positions are men. And what you're really going to get benefit is not necessarily pairing women with women, but sometimes it's pairing women with powerful men. And we have to weigh that out really whether that's the best fit or not. We need to do a little bit more research into how we're pairing out mentors and mentees. What's even stronger than mentorships have been found to be sponsors. The difference between a mentor and a sponsor is a mentor will give advice to a female employee or a female management official, but a sponsor will kind of more actively pull them along, introduce them to other people, invite them into meetings, give them more responsibilities and these type of things in addition to just giving advice. So we want to move beyond mentorship and really focus on sponsorship as a way to increase the value of women in the workplace. Certainly we can do the education that I talked about. Offering leadership workshops, for example, is a great way to increase the value of women within your organization. But don't overlook the way just the tasking is done. A lot of times research will find that in some organizations, men are getting the tasks that are going to be more prominent, the tasks that are going to yield more rewards, not only for that individual, but the corporation, thereby showing men in more favorable light, where sometimes women are given the tasking that, they're set up to fail, quite honestly, in some cases, or they're given the tasking that is of less value. So pay attention to the way tasking is doled out and the responsibilities given out to the men and women within your organization. So look at mentorships and sponsorships. educational opportunities, as well as the tasking itself. And I think those will go a long way, just those three things, to improving the value of women within the organization and start balancing it out. Don't overlook self-empowerment. Again, this kind of puts the onus on women themselves to empower themselves, but the organization can do some things in there as well. The organization can support self-empowerment. So think about a second, how can an organization support self-empowerment? If you happen to be in a group doing this webinar, you might just talk about this not only now for a second, but also after this webinar as well. I think a big way that an organization can support self-empowerment is basically to put the money where their mouth is. Do things such as maybe they won't offer a women's leadership workshop within the organization itself, but maybe they'll offer college tuition or offer attendance at conferences and these type of things to women within the organization that will allow women to increase their own value on behalf of the organization. So those are the type of things that can be done. Self-empowerment is a good thing, but it shouldn't all be on the women's shoulders to do it. We have to understand that the benefits derived of that don't just benefit the women that are taking these empowerment measures or being given these empowerment opportunities, but it benefits the whole organization. And so the organization itself should be behind these efforts, these self-empowerment efforts, 100%. There is a third way, number 3, on how the scale can be balanced. We talked about balancing it with the numbers. We talked about balancing it by increasing the value of women within the organization or within the group. But the third way is to manipulate the scale, is the way I look at it. Actually do activities that kind of force equitable participation and influence. And I'll talk about those. This is where the 5 comes in, the 5 strategies, as was promised in this presentation, or as I look at them, the 5 fingers of manipulation to manipulate these scales so that it is better balanced for the organization. These are awareness, safety, inclusion, allies, and authority. And we're going to talk about each of those 5 in turn for the remainder of this webinar. Awareness, or maybe you want to say non-awareness, which is often, maybe even too often the case in many organizations. This is a huge issue, and this is why I use it as a starting point. Nothing is fixed, nothing is solved until people are aware of the problem. I am a huge believer that talk and awareness goes a long way to being a catalyst for actions that yield results. In fact, I work with another group, the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group, that is focused on that alone, focusing on dialogue to cause change. Dialogue causes awareness. We have to have that as a starting point, as a minimum, before going any further. And in fact, this Catalyst research found out that the more we actually do improve men's awareness of gender bias, the more likely it is that they take ownership of that. And when they take ownership of it, then they start taking actions to address it. Understand that in many organizations, the power structure still is male dominant. And so we need to raise men's awareness in particular in order for these balancing activities to occur. There's a big disconnect in awareness between men and women. Women, if you ask them how much inequity in the workplace there is, 77% will be able to point out that those inequities. Only 56% of men will see the same. Only 33 to 36% of men still believe that gender bias exists in the workplace, and, open your eyes here, only 10% believe there's gender bias in their own workplace. Again, in any given workplace, only 10% of men think that there's gender bias that exists in that workplace, is really what that is saying. There is a catch to this. I want you to try to answer this, will be my pop quiz question of the day. What percentage of men believe progress for women comes at the expense of men? Let you consider that quiz question for a moment. The answer is 25%. 1 of every 4 men in your workplace believe that advancement of women comes at a cost of men. That's an awareness issue. Obviously, the research will tell a different story. If you raise the awareness, they'll see that benefits of women benefit everybody, not just women. It benefits the men in the organization as well. And so that's a key awareness hurdle we must get over. So we really need to focus on this awareness issue, number 1. So what are some of those best practices? Workshops, classes that we talked about, webinars such as this. I've seen a lot of creative solutions in other organizations I've worked with. Podcasts, Facebook Live, any of your social media outlets, media campaigns, published articles, summits, and again, virtual and live. And in these days of COVID, virtual be a big way of doing that. And just as importantly, open, engaging dialogue. And I'm going to touch on this a number of times because I think a lot of organizations are hesitant about having open dialogue on this topic. But I think it's an absolute must, and I'll mention it a number of times in the remainder of this webinar. I think it's more important maybe not to focus on the activities because there's a lot of activities that can raise awareness, but to really look at the goals. The goals are really to educate the people in our work groups, in our institutions, in our organizations, in our companies. Goal is to put a focus on this issue. You can't address it if we're not willing to shed light on it. And what we also want to do with awareness is get the buy-in needed to go forward. If people aren't believing in gender balance as a thing that should be strived for, it won't occur. A lot of companies are, rightfully so, when it comes to training, doing unconscious bias training. It's another very good starting point, but again, I'll call it just a starting point. We need to make people aware that biases exist. Everyone has biases. I have biases. You have biases. But when we are aware of our biases, only then can we set them aside and move past them. So unconscious bias is another good starting point to raise awareness. Also point out some of these things I've talked about today about the performance impacts of awareness. Sometimes we look at diversity and things like gender balance as purely an HR thing. We need to balance the numbers because, well, we need to balance the numbers for a reputation or whatever, but understand that also is a performance issue. It is an image issue. It's also a personal issue. It's all these things. It's all these very, very, very impactful things in the organization that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of. Maybe people don't understand that balancing the organization in terms of gender actually improves the performance. That is proven, again, by Catalyst, by Pew Research, et cetera, proven benefits of gender balance need to be made known. Talk. Again, there's a lot of reluctance out there in organizations I've worked with that are reluctant to talk about it, get very defensive about it. I think we need to have these conversations. Maybe they need to be facilitated. Maybe an organization doesn't feel comfortable having these conversations or hosting these conversations themselves. But organizations can encourage these conversations to take place, and an organization can bring in facilitators to have these conversations if need be. I'll mention also that as we have these conversations and as we're raising awareness, one of the more powerful features is if we can insert personal stories, personal impact stories. Sometimes that goes a lot farther than statistics. We want to include statistics also because the statistics speak very straightforwardly to certain types of people, and they need those statistics to be certain of something. So we want to include statistics, but we also want to include personal stories, either in a structured format or in the dialogue we have within the workplace on this topic. Another concept I'll throw out there is the concept of gender mainstreaming. This is very strong terminology used in the European community, not so much in the US community. What gender mainstreaming does, and if you've heard the term mainstreaming, it's the same thing here. It's the idea of putting focus on gender as an issue wherever and whenever possible. For example, if you go into a meeting and you're deciding, making a decision on something, you stop and ask, what are the implications for our male employees or our male customers and clients, and what are the implications for our female employees or our female stakeholders or our female clients? And we stop to ask the question. When I do a workshop, I pose the question as, let's say we agree, we're an environmental organization and we want to ban water bottles, or maybe we're a community organization. We want to ban water bottles for ecological reasons. Well, gender mainstream says, okay, well, let's do that, but before we do it, let's consider the impacts on men and the impacts of women. Are those impacts the same? We have to consider that maybe a lot of the hard blue-collar labor is still being done by men. Doesn't mean there's not a lot of females involved with that, but dominantly it's still males. And what's the impact of banning water bottles for that segment of the workforce? Caretakers still today in 2020 is primarily taken on by the female in the household. What are the implications of banning water bottles then on females that may be caring for children at home or away from home? So gender mainstream is just a way of framing any decision or any conversation in terms of impacts for males and females, be they employees in the organization or be they constituents or be they clients, stakeholders, or whatever. We look at that gender lens. We look through that gender lens to make these decisions as a way to focus on gender in the workplace. Okay. The next item is safety. I'll just say up front that when people don't feel safe in an organization or a group, they will not perform well. When people do not feel safe, they do not perform. We have to address the safety issue, the harassment issue, these things, and we're talking about sexual harassment in the workplace. So quiz, anywhere from what % of women report having experienced sexual harassment in the workplace? That would be anywhere from 25 to 85%, depending on what research you look at. Even at the low end, that's 1 out of every 4. And think of it, if that's at the high end, how detrimental that is to your organization, not only performance-wise, but retention-wise, and these type of things as well. What % of sexual harassment goes unreported? 87 to 94% goes unreported. So maybe you have heard of sexual harassment in your organization, but it is literally the very tip of the iceberg. The very, very tip. So much goes unreported. And what % of harassment victims experience retaliation? 75%. And this is why it's unreported. 75% of people experiencing harassment don't report it or because of retaliation. We have to address the safety issue, not only to keep it from happening, but to allow it to be reported. And harassment, this is the key thing here in this talk today, harassment is more prevalent in imbalanced workplaces. So why don't men and women help solve this in the workplace? Bystander effect, they believe that others will take responsibility. Conformity, they're worried about looking like an outsider if they stand up for someone else. Psychological standing, maybe they just don't see it as their issue, it's not their problem, these type of things. we need to overcome. So address the safety issue. I'm going to tell you how here in a minute. I think lately, before I go there, lately this has gotten even worse because of Me Too. And again, I'm going to say Me Too is a very positive thing, very positive. Don't take my words as saying anything negative about it whatsoever. But because of it, some men have gotten even more reluctant, studies have shown, to maybe stand up for women, or they're just uncomfortable working very closely with women and having these difficult conversations, or even just working side by side. A lot of the research is showing that discomfort has actually become more prevalent. We need to work through that discomfort. And again, for my money, it's going to be talk number one that gets us past this hurdle, if you will. So 51% of all adults questioned said that the recent focus on sexual harassment has made it harder for men to know how to interact with women in the workplace. We don't want that. We need men and women working together side by side as closely as possible to get the work done. So we must overcome this. Half of managers surveyed reported being uncomfortable participating in a common work activity with a woman. Can you believe that? Half of male managers feel uncomfortable working with their female subordinates. You have to imagine how detrimental that is to performance in the workplace. So how do we get past this? Again, I'm going to say dialogue number one. We have to be able to figure out, have those critical and difficult conversations. They must take place. In order to get past that reluctance and start addressing this issue head on, we have to have that discussion. I've gone into a number of organizations, even within the government, where they just would not do this out of defensiveness. They wanted to rely on rules, regulations, and laws, and that alone, and just would not entertain the dialogue that must take place. Not that the rules and the laws are unimportant, they absolutely are. In fact, we need to apply them with a mentality of zero tolerance. We need to be aware of those laws. We need to apply them without exception. We have to adopt, every organization should have its own anti-harassment policy and ensure that all employees not only receive it, but understand it. Every organization should have their own policy. Yes, there's Title VII, Title IX, these type of things out there, but you really need to take ownership of it by having an internal policy as well. Ensure there's an effective reporting and response procedures that not only allow people to report anonymously, but to do so without any type of retribution or repercussions whatsoever. Focus on the reporting system. If you can make the reporting system work, these other things are easier to address. Train everybody on how to avoid, respond, and report these harassing behaviors in the workplace. Any behavior, bullying, whatever it is that makes a person feel unsafe is unwanted and needs to go. Document this and monitor it and be transparent. It may be embarrassing for an organization to show that a lot of harassment is taking place within the organization, but until that transparency is there, no one's going to address it. It's just going to be hidden under a rug. And as I always say, when you push a problem under the rug, it's going to be tripped over time and time and time again. So make it transparent, put the reporting system in place, and then train everybody on how to spot harassment and how to report it. And then make accountability a key part of that. Zero tolerance. Everyone is accountable. Next one is inclusion. Again, a lot of people look at inclusion as bringing someone to the table, and I'll get to that analogy because I think it is kind of an accurate analogy, but it's not the only issue we're talking about here. We're not just talking about bringing people in and including them in a process. We're also talking about making things available to people inclusively. Things such as visibility, resources, tools, people, assignments, experience, help, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mentioned the one earlier that women get 20% less feedback than men do. That's not inclusive, that's exclusive. So what other things, and you can talk about this amongst yourselves, Think about this offline, if you will. But what other things are exclusionary in nature based on the imbalance in an organization? I'm sure you could come up with several more than what are listed here. The analogy of a seat at a table does certainly hold true when we're talking about inclusion. It's about bringing people in, but it goes beyond that. I always say you got to bring people in first. Number two, you have to give them voice. It's not enough just to sit someone at a table and have them be quiet or dominate them, dominate their voices or not let their voices be heard. If we define gender balance and the benefits thereof as contribution and influence parity, we have to allow them to participate by giving them voice in the processes. See at the table, then voice, and beyond that, we have to value that voice. It's not enough just to let someone talk. Do we really value what they have to say and value who they are for saying it? I show this chart a lot, and I always tell my workshop participants, I wish I had all day I could talk about this. These are leadership, so-called leadership traits, and who people believe possess these leadership traits. This was just a public opinion poll, but the public is who's coming into your workplace. The public is your employees, and these are their beliefs. For example, they believe that very confident people, men are, but that's a very strong leadership trait, and men are that and women are not. What does that say? It just says a lot of people in organizations see men as confident and therefore leaders, don't see women as confident and therefore don't see them as leaders. Look at another one. How about sensitive? I like to point this one out. A lot of people don't see sensitive as a leadership trait. They don't see men possessing that very strongly, but they see women strongly very much. So really what this gets down to is, what are we valuing? As it turns out, we're valuing strong male traits and disvaluing strong female traits. But here's the catch. If you look at the top of this chart, it doesn't say male trait and female trait. It correctly labels them masculine traits and feminine traits. Just because sensitivity, another one I like to use a lot is empathy, which isn't in this chart. But sensitivity or empathy is seen as a feminine trait does not mean that only females possess that trait. Many, many men possess that trait as well. Going back to what I said earlier about confidence, just because confidence is seen as a masculine trait does not in any way, shape, or form mean that women are less confident than are men. Again, this is just perception. And any female can be just as confident as any male. In fact, any male can have any number of these masculine and feminine traits, and any female can have any number of these masculine and feminine traits. The problem is, what do we value? And as it turns out, we value in the workplace masculine traits, and we make the leap that masculine traits are the domain of men. And it's wholly, wholly incorrect on so many levels. This is another, when we talk about inclusiveness, we have to learn how to value those traits that are seen as feminine and those traits that the women coming into the workplace possess. And understand that these traits can be owned by men or women, and they're all valuable. They're all valuable and necessary. It has been proven over and over again that organizations that learn how to leverage the greater number of these traits, whether they're masculine traits or feminine traits, the organizations that leverage most of these are the organizations that succeed more. We need to value all of these, and that's part of inclusion in my mind. A lot of studies will bear this out about men and women have an equal number of these traits in equal measure, and the value of these traits in equal measure of the research is there to back it up. I don't have time to go into it, but it is there. We need to make that part of our inclusive training, is to value things like empathy, sensitivity, and understand that women can be every bit as decisive, confident, aggressive as men are, and to get over this notion that certain traits belong to one gender and another and aren't as valuable as one set of traits or another. Inclusion best practices. Go back to this tasking again. Look about who's getting what assignments, who's being assigned as team leaders to what projects, for example, or who's even being put on what teams. We need to pay attention to that very closely. Bring them to the table, but then give them opportunities to have voice. That may mean we have to put procedures in place in meetings, for example, to allow that voice to occur in equal measure. And just because only 20% of the participants at a table are women does not mean that men get to say 80% of the words at that meeting. We need to figure out how to create that equity. And one way we can do that is to put procedures in place that allow more voice by our minority participants. In this case, our gender minority, which is typically women. Find ways to amplify women's voices and train on the value of this diverse input. Let everyone know that our diverse input is not only as valuable as our conformed input, but even more so. And we can do this by tracking the amount of time and pointing out who's getting time and make a more concerted effort to see our processes that take place in opportunities of voice. Meetings is one key place that happens. And again, provide more of these opportunities, give more opportunities at the podium, for example. Those would be my best practices for inclusion. I love this slide because if you look at the slide that's behind these men in this slide, they are there, a forum for how to create better gender balance in the military forces. It's an all-male forum. A lot of times we'll start calling these manuals in conferences because a lot of you look at a lot of panels in conferences still today, there's still sometimes a majority of men. Last thing we need to do in terms of inclusion is ask the question, where are the women? When we see something like this, we ask, where are the women? When someone's organizing a conference and you see the participants and you see it dominated by men, we ask, where are women? Status quo will always remain status quo until challenged. Status quo will remain status quo until challenged. You must challenge it, and we must stand up and ask, where are the women? And we have to do that. Men, you have to do this too. Women as well. All of us need to stand up and do this when we see this imbalance, inclusionary imbalance. And the final thing that's being done in inclusion is we can have inclusive practices. Our scheduling and telework, or telecommute, telework, whatever you want to call it, again, going back to the concept of gender mainstreaming, are the impacts for our practices and programs equal for men and equal for women? Are they inclusive in that manner? Do they have the same number of positive impacts, and do they limit the negative impacts in equal measure within that men? Maybe we find out that our telecommuting practices somehow favor men. For example, women are still, in most households, still the caregiver, and maybe the way we run virtual, which is very prominent right now, of course, maybe somehow women are impacted that or hampered by that more so than men are. And I guarantee you that that's the case. We need to figure out, well, we have this new policy in place that allows more virtual work, but does that policy include ways to balance that work out so that it's men and women can equally contribute in those situations? Look at our work-life programs, look at our wellness programs, look at our flex accounts, et cetera, and make sure that the impacts are equitable between men and women in all regards. Allies are a big issue here. First and foremost, understand that male allies in particular are probably in power positions more so than women, not always the case, but usually the case, and they have very valuable knowledge. We need these male allies to stand up and share some of this internal knowledge that they've acquired over the years with women in some cases. They have to show a genuine understanding. They have to understand the problem. They have to understand the impacts of harassment in the workplace. They have to understand that when you balance an organization, better things come out of that. And so our allies have to be very educated and self-aware in this regards. And they have to be committed to doing what's right. They have to be the people that stand up and say, where are the women? They must do these three things in order to be effective allies in the workplace. Sometimes our employee resource groups operate as allies in this regards. I have found in my work as a consultant is that some ERGs are just not resourced to do these type of things. Again, leadership and organization, put your money where your mouth is and resource these ERGs so that they can do this type of work. They can be allies within the workplace to women in the workplace. Women can form their own groups to self-empower. This is an issue of self-empowerment maybe. Circles, we may have heard of empowerment circles, or there's different terminology. Sheryl Sandberg, I forget what she calls them, but women can get together and self-empower as well and be their own allies in this regard. He for She programs, kudos to UN organizations for not only implementing this, but actually owning this. And it really has honestly raised awareness more than anything else. If you can come up in your organization with your own he for she type program to raise awareness, that will go so far. But you got to do your homework. You got to ask women to participate and share their stories. Ask them what is needed in your organization. And then you have to get out of the way to allow that space for women to occupy that space and contribute and influence equitably within the organizations. Sometimes creating that space is a matter of sharing the emotional labor in the organization. The women don't have to be the emotional caretakers of the organization, nor do they have to do the organizational housework of the organization. In order to make space for women in these more valuable positions, men have to pick up some of the slack and some of this other caretaking type work that needs to be done in the organization, and those type of things. Finally, the last of the 5 is authority. Unless you have strong leadership that's willing to stand up and enforce the rules, create the policies and enforce the policies, unless you have a director that will stand behind the programs that are developed, whether they're developed by human resources, whether they're developed by your employee resource group, wherever they arrive from, if the authority figures do not back those very openly, very verbally, you're not going to get buy-in within the organization, and all of these things will fall flat. All your initiatives, all your programs, without authority, they will fall flat. I have seen it time and time again. In the organizations that have really succeeded, the leadership has been very open about what they support and why they support it, why they enforce these rules, why they back this program, and say it over and over again so that leadership sets the tone for the rest of the organization with this involved. If you don't have strong leadership or strong authority, and I'll say this, the authority doesn't always have to come from the executives or the directors. Sometimes we can delegate that authority to employee resource groups, for example. If that authority is delegated, truly delegated to employee resource groups, maybe they become the authority and they can do these things. But someone has to have the authority, and the authority has to be concrete and it has to be made known. If a leadership person is empowering some other authority, they have to make that known so that everyone understands that that group is the authority on this, and what they say carries the weight. So it's very important role for leadership to take, either to take ownership themselves or make it known that ownership or authority is given to other people, and then to keep repeating this process of showing that we back these things 100%. So that's the thrust of my work, and those were the 5 things. If you focus on those 5 areas, awareness, we talked about ways to raise awareness, ways to bring in more inclusion, make the environment more inclusive, address the safety issue, bring in more allies, and there's many ways to establish ally programs, and make sure that authority exists. Those 5 things can manipulate the scale. Now that doesn't mean that we can only manipulate the scale. I have not, in any way, I hope I have not, poo-pooed number balancing. That certainly is important. Do those processes to balance the numbers and also do those empowerment processes to raise the value of women in your organization as well, through leadership workshops or supporting self-empowerment and these type of things. Again, all this is in my book if you care to read that, but I'm open if you want to email me, ask me specific questions. Believe me, I'm more than happy to talk about this, but I hope, I would love to have these conversations. We can't do it in person here in this webinar, but I love these conversations. And if you want to set up a group conversation, I'm all for that as well. So that's what I have, Joanne. So it's been great being here today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dave. We appreciate you taking the time to educate our audience on this important topic. Again, I want to thank you all for joining today's webinar. Like if you have any question, David's email is up and his phone number, but any other questions regarding National Diversity Council, you can definitely email me at dejaron.campbell@nationaldiversitycouncil.org. Enjoy your day. Thank you
Thank you,
so much.
Dejaron.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.